Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all of our listeners around the world. My name is Andrea Peters, and I'm a moderator for today's event, Stop the Drive to World War III, sponsored by the International Committee of the Fourth International and the World Socialist website. Over the last several days, the world has been brought to the brink of a global conflagration that could quickly escalate into a standoff between nuclear-armed states. The relentless anti-Russian war drive of the United States and NATO provoked the Putin government's invasion of Ukraine, a criminal act with devastating consequences for the working class of that region, and one which has no progressive content. We are gathered here today in order to discuss and deepen our understanding of the social, economic, and political forces that brought about this disaster, and to lay the groundwork for the building of a mass anti-war movement. In addition to my co-moderator, Thomas Scripps, our panelists today are David North, Nick Beams, Johannes Stern, Evan Blake, and Joseph Kishore. They are all leading members of the International Committee of the Fourth International. We will begin by hearing some introductory remarks from each of them. After this, we will move into a question and answer period during which listeners will have a chance to submit their own questions. I would like to invite David North, Chairman of the International Editorial Board of the WSWS, and National Chairperson of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States, to start off today's event. David is the author of dozens of works on history, Marxist theory, and politics. In 2016, he published A Quarter Century of War, the U.S. Drive for Global Hegemony. So David, I'd like to pass things over to you now.
David is muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Start again. Thank you very much, Andrea. This online meeting has been called in response to the outbreak of war in Ukraine. The purpose of this meeting is to place the conflict in its objective historical and political context, and to outline the principles and program upon which socialists must base their opposition to not only the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also, and above all, the aim of the Biden administration and its European allies to exploit this war, for which they have carefully prepared and do their best to incite, in the interests of their global objectives. In determining one's attitude to a given war, there is no approach more politically and intellectually bankrupt than that which focuses and obsesses on the question, who fired the first shot? This question abstracts a single incident from the vast complex of interacting economic, political, social, and geostrategic interests and circumstances with deep historical roots and operating on a global scale that suddenly attain the political equivalent of critical mass and triggers the eruption of military violence. This does not mean that war simply happened automatically. The decision to launch a war is made by individuals, and they must be held accountable for their decisions. But the decision to launch a war is always taken under the pressure of objective circumstances. This is true not only for Vladimir Putin, but also for Joseph Biden and all his predecessors in the White House, whose decisions have kept the United States at war for the last 30 years. This critical element of subjective responsibility, including that of American presidents, must be emphasized in the face of the massive propaganda barrage that has been unleashed by the Russian invasion. The giant Wurlitzer of propaganda, scripted by the intelligence agencies in the United States and Europe, and belched out by the corporate media, present the war as the work of one evil man, namely Vladimir Putin. According to the official narrative, Putin's resort to war has stunned a world that could have hardly imagined such an outrageous violation of blissful peace. Acceptance of this narrative requires not only the suspension of all the faculties of critical thought, but also mass amnesia. It requires that one forgets all the wars that have been launched by the United States with the support of its NATO clients during the last 3 decades. And the background of all of this, of course, and we will be discussing this in greater detail, are the consequences of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The invasion of Iraq in early 1991, which took place as that dissolution was underway, marked the beginning of an unending series of bombing campaigns and invasions launched by the United States. For the sake of time, I will reference only U.S. military engagements that occurred since the 1990s. We will not talk about the intervention in Lebanon in 1983, the invasion of the tiny island of Grenada, which was, one must recall, proclaimed by Reagan to be a great threat to world peace. That also took place in 1983. Nor will we discuss the intense involvement of the Reagan administration in dirty counterinsurgency wars against the people of Nicaragua and El Salvador throughout the 1980s, and the invasion of Panama in 1989. And since our subject is not ancient history, we will not talk about the horrific decade-long war against the people of Vietnam in the 1960s and 1970s, the invasion of Korea in the early 1950s, and the dropping of 2 atom bombs on 2 defenseless Japanese cities after the war in Asia during World War II had been all but officially won. And since our subject is war, we will not dwell on the innumerable coups d'etats organized and financed by the United States in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, even though these filthy operations resulted in a staggering loss of life. For example, the 1965 coup in Indonesia resulted in the killing of approximately 500,000 people by the military junta which the United States brought to power. Now, the major military engagements of the United States in the 1990s were the invasion of Iraq, Somalia, and Haiti, and the 78-day bombing campaign of Serbia, whose purpose was to force the country to accept the extraction of the province of Kosovo. Judging from the now daily references to the invasion of Ukraine as an event without precedent in Europe since World War II, it appears that the merciless bombing of Serbia, including its capital city of Belgrade, has been erased from history. And I would like at this point just to show a clip from that period of history in 1999. Could you run that?
The offensive was launched to force Serbian troops out of the province of Kosovo after accusations that the Serbs were committing atrocities against the ethnic Albanians. A decade on, Serbia is a country still wrestling with its past, as Jane Azzopardi reports.
The first bombing of its kind in NATO history. On March 24, 1999, Western nations carried out their threat against Serbia and began the biggest military conflict on Serbian soil since World War II. NATO saw the war as the only way to end President Slobodan Milosevic's violent crackdown in Kosovo, where his Serb nationalist forces were accused of ethnic cleansing against Kosovo's largely Muslim ethnic Albanian population. But what began as an attack on military targets soon expanded. Schools, monuments, homes, and even the Chinese embassy were hit. At the end of the campaign, 11 weeks later, Human Rights Watch estimates around 500 civilians were killed.
Then and now, I think it was a great mistake by NATO. The bombing shouldn't have happened. I think the goals which NATO wanted to achieve could have been done with less energy, and citizens could have been spared from what happened.
I think it's worth. I think this event should be recalled, especially under conditions. There may well be attacks, and apparently they are already taking place in Kiev. And while that attack must be condemned, it should not be forgotten that the United States and NATO showed no reluctance to simply flatten much of Belgrade in 1999. Now, that was not the end of it. Since the war on terror was launched in 2001, the United States has been engaged in a global rampage of unending violence. Permit me to quote from a book titled The United States of War by Professor David Vine. It was published in 2020. And he writes the following. As terrible as the impact of the post-2001 wars has been in the United States, death, injury, and trauma in the countries where the U.S. military has fought is orders of magnitude worse. An estimated 755,000 to 786,000 civilians and combatants on all sides have died in just Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, and Yemen since U.S. forces began fighting in those countries. That figure is around 50 times larger than the number of U.S. dead. But that's only the number of combatants and civilians who have died in combat. Many more have died as a result of disease, hunger, and malnutrition caused by the wars and the destruction of healthcare systems, employment, sanitation, and other local infrastructure. While these deaths are still being calculated and debated by researchers, the total number could reach a minimum of 3 million, around 200 times more the number of U.S. dead. An estimate of 4 million deaths may be a more accurate, though still conservative figure. Meanwhile, the entire neighborhoods, cities, and societies have been shattered by the U.S.-led wars. In Afghanistan, surveys have indicated that 2/3 of the population may have mental health problems, with half suffering from anxiety and 1 in 5 from PTSD. By 2007 in Iraq, 28% of young people were now malnourished. Half living in Baghdad had witnessed a major traumatic event, and nearly 2/3 had PTSD diagnoses. As of 2019, more than 10 million have likely been displaced from their homes in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya alone, becoming refugees abroad or internally displaced people within their countries. Alongside the human damage, the financial costs of the post-2001 US-led wars are so large, they're nearly incomprehensible. As of late 2020, US taxpayers have already spent or should expect to eventually spend a minimum of $6.4 trillion on the post-2001 wars, including future veterans benefits and interest payments on the money borrowed to pay for the wars. The actual costs are likely to run to hundreds of billions or trillions more, depending on when these seemingly endless wars actually end. Now, the filthy propaganda campaign against Russia is particularly disturbing. The type of hatred now being spewed out in the media really has no precedent. I'm old enough to remember the era of the Cold War. And this type of anti-Russian, or what was then called anti-Soviet hatred, was largely confined to the lunatic fringe. Notwithstanding the confrontations of that era, which nearly led to a nuclear exchange, the type of hatred, vile denunciations were not to be found, at least in the respectable corporate press. In fact, and I raise this because of the banning of the conductor, Valery Gergin, from conducting at Carnegie Hall, it may come as a surprise to many to know that during the 1950s and 1960s, there was a veritable golden age of cultural exchange. There was widespread admiration for Soviet achievements. Some 61 years ago, Yuri Gagarin was launched into space to the astonishment, but also to the admiration of many in the United States. The Cuban Missile Crisis took place in 1962, and there are many parallels which can be drawn between that event and that which is now occurring. It should be recalled that at that time, the reason given by Kennedy for threatening nuclear war was that the Russians had placed ballistic missiles in Cuba. And he claimed that this placement of missiles on an island 70 miles from Florida was an unacceptable threat to the security of the United States. No one was talking then in the American government about the right of Cuba to organize itself in whatever defense pact it wanted, or to take military help from foreign powers. Of course, the United States has its own Monroe Doctrine, in which it proclaims the entire hemisphere to be its property. That event nearly led to war. Without going into the details of that event, it is also worth recalling its aftermath. There was a speech given by Kennedy at American University in 1963, in which he said the following. And this was coming from a man who was certainly a Cold War warrior and anti-communist, and no apologies are to be made for his politics. But I think it gives some sense of the difference in the political and cultural climate of this country, that at that time, it was still possible for an American president to say the following, and I quote, "We can hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, and in acts of courage. Among the many traits the people of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other. And no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union suffered in the course of the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and farms were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including nearly 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the devastation of this country east of Chicago." And then he went on to say, referring to the American and Soviet people, "For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we all are mortal." It is impossible to imagine a US president speaking that way today. One gets nothing but denunciations, insults, criminalizing, conduct in a manner which is in fact aimed at provoking the most violent and even irrational response. Again, referring to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and if I deal with this because so little is known of history, one of the major concerns of the Kennedy administration was that it should not do anything which leads to a miscalculation on the part of the Soviet Union. He was greatly concerned about this. And yet, one would not know from anything Biden says that he is taking serious note of the fact that Russia does have nuclear weapons, that in a climate of confrontation, the danger of miscalculation is very great. and under conditions in which denunciations are being made, personal threats are being made, and so on. Sanctions against individuals, against presidents, against foreign ministers. How can we know that in a moment of confusion, the worst possible conclusions could be drawn and a decision or one of the parties comes to the conclusion that a nuclear war has begun? This is an extremely dangerous situation. But we have to look at this level of recklessness as well in a political context. What is it that accounts for this situation? My comrade Nick Beams is going to go into the economic background, which gives some sense of the scale of the present crisis. But I just want, in terms of introducing these issues, to make the point that what we have here is an intersection in this present crisis of two elements which are always present in any war. There are, of course, long-standing American geopolitical interests, which were outlined as far back in 1992, when the United States decided, in the aftermath of the dissolution of the USSR, and adopted as its strategic doctrine the principle that never again will the United States tolerate a competitor. It will not allow another competitor to emerge, and that applies not only to Russia, which is not directly an economic competitor, but a geopolitical problem from the standpoint of the achievement of American global aims, but it certainly applies to China, and one must add, to the Europeans themselves, a fact which I think accounts for their incredible fear of falling afoul of American desires and intentions. But there's also, and this is in the present situation, the most decisive, the domestic crisis. It should be recalled that only a month ago, Biden stated that no one could say for sure that American democracy will survive the decade. This is a country that is racked by domestic crisis on a scale unprecedented in its history, certainly since the era of the Civil War. Comrade Joe Kishore will discuss this in greater detail. But we have the combination of economic crisis, social crisis, political crisis. After all, just a year has passed since the first significant and major and almost successful attempt was made to overthrow the government of this country in a domestic insurgency. It is hard to avoid the conclusion that one of the aims, or perhaps the decisive aim underlying the recklessness with which this crisis is being pursued, incited, and driven forward, even to the point of an open conflict with a nuclear armed power, is to somehow overcome the domestic crisis and establish a new basis for unity on the basis of war hysteria. And overhanging all of this, which has brought the domestic crisis to a fever pitch, is the staggering impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which will also be discussed in the course of this meeting by Evan. One further point must be made about the pandemic. We are not indifferent to the loss of life in Kiev and throughout the Ukraine. The great mass of people who are there are totally innocent, are not responsible for the policies of NATO, nor are they allied with fascists. They are being victimized just as the Russian people are being victimized. Nevertheless, it should be pointed out, just to keep a sense of proportion, that so far, the number of dead as in the course of this war does not even come close to the approximately 2,000 people who died just yesterday in the United States as a result of COVID. The losses are staggering. Approximately 150,000 Americans have died since the beginning of the year. The figures for deaths in Russia and Ukraine, where the pandemic is also raging, are also horrifying. And in this situation, rather than concentrating on a common struggle to put an end to this pandemic, we have the American and European governments now wasting vast resources, fighting a war which should not be fought, provoking and inciting conflict, rather than concentrating on the fundamental war that must be fought, the war against COVID-19. Now, we'll have more time to discuss these issues in the course of this meeting, but I do want to conclude by elaborating our attitude to the policies of the Russian government. We are irreconcilably opposed, as should every socialist and every class-conscious worker, to the attack on Ukraine by Russia. There is nothing of any progressive character contained in the policies that have led to this attack. As we said in a statement issued by the International Committee this week, the problems created by the dissolution of the Soviet Union cannot be solved by a reversion to the chauvinist policies of Russian nationalism. In fact, what one sees in the policies of Putin is a combination of pre-1917 nationalism drawn from the chauvinism of Prime Minister Stolypin, the Prime Minister of Tsarist Russia between 1907 and 1911, and even more fundamentally, the nationalist policies of Stalin. It is interesting, and I hope that we'll have a chance, and we certainly will discuss this in greater detail in the course of this meeting, that in justifying his attack on Ukraine, Putin explicitly denounced the October Revolution, Lenin, and the entire internationalist basis upon which the Soviet Union was established. 100 years ago, Lenin initiated the political struggle that was actually to lead to the founding of the Trotskyist opposition in the Soviet Union. He denounced the nationalism and chauvinism displayed by Stalin and some of his cohorts in the Soviet bureaucracy toward the national rights of different national groupings in the USSR, in particular the Georgians and also the Ukrainians. It is probably not well known, let alone understood, that the basis of the Soviet Union was a recognition of the right of national minorities to independence. Substantial steps were taken to creating a unique framework for equality among all the nationalities, and in particular, achieving that through a determined limitation on the influence of the great Russian nation within the USSR. Putin denounces that. He, in fact, claims that it is the legacy of Lenin that is responsible for the persistence of nationalism in Ukraine. In fact, it is the suppression of the legitimate manifestations of Ukrainian identity, particularly during the Stalin regime, in many, many violent forms, which enabled the healthy national sentiments within the Ukrainian people, in which immense socialist influence was to be found, that enabled extremely right-wing elements and fascistic elements to gain a significant following within Ukraine. The attack on Ukraine is totally antithetical to the Marxist tradition, to socialism. And the claim that somehow this is justified in the name of a fight against fascists in Ukraine is entirely false. This invasion undermines the unity of the Russian and Ukrainian working class. It disorients the working class in both countries, and indeed the working class throughout the world. It creates the climate for the growth of war fever, for warmongering, it contributes nothing to the development of class consciousness. And I want to stress this absolutely fundamental and critical point because it's so poorly understood. Genuine revolutionaries, genuine socialists, build their policies on the basis of the fight for the class consciousness of the working class. Reaction cannot be defeated. Capitalism cannot be defeated except through the development of the class consciousness of the working class on a global scale. We do not look to any government, whatever its pretensions or whatever its claims, to solve historical tasks that can only be achieved through the working class and its revolutionary action, least of all such gigantic tasks as the overthrow of private ownership of the means of production and the end of the nation-state system. Any policy that cuts across the development of class consciousness is reactionary. And so we have to make this point as strongly and as emphatically as we can. Our opposition to the policies of Putin is not based on simply a moralistic denunciation of war. It's based on very clear, objective calculations of what is involved in the fight for revolutionary class consciousness. This is the basis of our work today. We seek to build a global anti-war movement based on the working class. That is the basic revolutionary force in society. That is the only reliable basis for the building of an anti-war movement, because that anti-war movement must be directed against capitalism, against imperialism, against all forms of national chauvinism. And so we hope that today's meeting will contribute to a better understanding of this policy, to the objective background of the crisis that has now erupted. And we hope that many of you who are now watching this webinar will draw from this presentation the conclusion that you have to fight for socialism, that you have to join the International Committee of the Fourth International, take up the fight for genuine Marxism, ally yourself with the great revolutionary traditions of the Trotskyist movement, which is the Marxism of the 21st century. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion we'll now have.
Well, thank you very much, David. And our next speaker to make some introductory remarks will be Nick Beams. Nick is a member of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website. He is an authority on Marxist political economy and has played a leading role in the Trotskyist movement for 5 decades. He will be speaking tonight on the economic crisis underpinning the war drive.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome to all our viewers and listeners around the world. Leon Trotsky once wrote that when a serious change takes place in the situation, a sharp turn, it is necessary to probe analytically more deeply to determine the qualitative aspect and, if possible, also to measure quantitatively the impulse of economics on politics. I want to place my remarks within this framework to lay bare the economic forces behind the war crisis and how the working class must respond to it. The International Committee of the Fourth International and the World Socialist website have continually pointed to the essential driving force of the wars waged by US imperialism over the past 30 years. It is the striving of the US to counter its long-term economic decline through military means. The events of the past 2 years and those of the past months and days point to the fact that the economic crisis is reaching a qualitative turning point. There are immediate expressions of this. Last month, the US Treasury announced that government debt had topped $30 trillion. That is, it was now $7 trillion more than the entire economic output of the US economy in a year. Corporate debt, very often financed through risky operations, is now more than $10 trillion. Recalling the old saying that those whom the gods would destroy they must first make mad, the financial system has become ever more bizarre. The cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, rises and falls by thousands of dollars, sometimes in a single day. So-called meme stocks, representing little intrinsic value, are propelled into the stratosphere only to come crashing down. Tech companies, which have yet to turn a profit, see their shares skyrocket, often recording market valuations exceeding those of established companies many times over. And one could go on. Let me trace out how this crisis has developed historically. Its starting point can be readily identified. On August 15, 1971, faced with a mounting balance of trade and payments problems, President Nixon removed the gold backing from the US dollar, ending the post-war monetary system which the US itself had established at the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944. That conference and the agreement was part of US efforts to reconstruct world capitalism out of the ashes of World War I and World War II. Its demise at the hands of the US itself signified the onset of its economic decline. As a result of the turbulence that followed, marked by inflation and the deep recessions of the 1970s and 1980s, a restructuring of US and world capitalism took place. It had two interconnected components. First, the globalization of production, starting in the 1980s, as capital used technologies based on the microchip to reorganize production to exploit cheaper sources of labor. This had profound consequences. It has intensified to an enormous degree one of the central contradictions of the capitalist system identified by the Marxist movement with the outbreak of World War I, that between the global development of the productive forces and the division of the world into rival and conflicting nation states and imperialist powers. The second consequence was the rise of so-called financial engineering, speculation on the financial markets, asset stripping, often involving outright criminal activities, as increasingly the chief means for profit accumulation. Karl Marx long ago pointed out that since the aim and driving force of capitalism was not the production of material goods and services needed for the maintenance of society, but the transformation of money into still more money, attempts would be made to do this without the inconvenience of the production process. That was still only an episodic tendency in his day. But by the 1980s, as the crisis of American capitalism deepened, it was becoming the dominant mode of profit accumulation. However, the process did not proceed smoothly. On the 19th of October, 1987, Wall Street crashed. The Dow recorded a 50% drop, still the largest ever single-day fall, the result of an orgy of speculation. The market crash resulted in a turning point in the administration of monetary policy by the US Federal Reserve. In a one-line statement, the newly installed Fed chair, Alan Greenspan, said all the resources of the Fed would be made available to support the financial system. This was the start of a new program. The task of the Fed was not to prevent the formation of speculative bubbles, but to clean up the mess when they burst and pour in more money via lower interest rates to finance a new round of speculation. This process continued through the 1990s and into the present century amid a series of financial storms. These included the bond crisis of 1994, the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98, the collapse of the hedge fund, long-term capital management in 1998 because of speculation in the Russian ruble, and the tech wreck of 2000-2001. Then came the financial crisis of 2008, the result of the speculation that had preceded it. The crisis in the subprime mortgage market was the trigger, but the practices in that area were so widespread, they threatened to bring down the entire US and global financial system. Interest rate cuts were no longer sufficient. A new policy was embarked on, quantitative easing. It involved the purchase of treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities by the Fed, coupled with a government bailout of the corporations and banks running into many hundreds of billions of dollars. Quantitative easing was designated as an emergency measure to be withdrawn as soon as conditions returned to normal. That day never came. The financial system had become so addicted to and so dependent on the cheap money provided by the Fed that the halting of its flow threatened another crisis. Over the first phase of quantitative easing, the Fed expanded its balance sheet, its holdings of assets, from around 800 billion to 4 trillion. In 2018, under conditions of a limited upturn in the global economy after the disaster of 2008, the Fed did attempt to return to a more normal policy, initiating a series of interest rate increases and a reduction in its asset holdings at the rate of $50 billion a month. The market rapidly delivered its verdict. In 2018, it recorded the biggest December drop since December 1931 in the depths of the Great Depression. The Fed, now under the chairmanship of Jerome Powell, beat a hasty retreat. In January 2019, he declared that interest rate rises were off the table and asset reduction had been halted. In July of that year, when the economy was growing, the Fed started to cut interest rates. So when the COVID-19 pandemic struck in February, March 2020, it impacted on a financial system that was already highly unstable. It acted as a trigger event, setting in motion a crisis potentially even more significant than that of 2008. Amid wildcat strikes and demands for safety measures to deal with the pandemic, the great fear on Wall Street was that such action would lead to a crisis. It would cut off the flow of surplus value from the working class, the basis of all profit in the final analysis, and collapse the debt mountain. The March 2020 crisis went far beyond the stock market, which fell dramatically despite of a series of emergency measures by the Fed. The crisis struck at the very core of the US and global financial system, the $22 trillion market for Treasury bonds. In times of turmoil, Treasury bonds are seen as a safe haven and they are bought up. But the market flipped. Treasury bonds were now being sold off in a dash for cash. At one point, in some segments of the market, there were no buyers for US government debt. No one wanted to buy what was supposedly the safest financial asset in the world. The US Treasury market had frozen. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. The Fed, together with the Trump administration, undertook a massive intervention. The government handed out hundreds of billions of dollars to the corporations under the CARES Act. The Fed stepped forward as the backstop for all areas of the financial system. It bought federal debt, mortgage debt, municipal debt, consumer debt, student debt, credit card debt, short-term commercial debt, and even stocks. As a result of the Fed's intervention in March, which saw it spending at one point $1 million a second, and the ongoing support over the past 2 years, the Fed's balance sheet has expanded from $4 trillion to almost $9 trillion. Once the market had been stabilized, the mantra of the ruling classes became, the cure cannot be worse than the disease. That is, no effective measures would be taken to deal with the pandemic because this would produce a crisis on Wall Street. The massive intervention has seen a rise of the market to record heights, and the accumulation of untold wealth by the pandemic billionaires, while millions of people around the world have needlessly died. There have been various reports on the March 2020 crisis. They point out that while the Fed's action stopped an immediate collapse, they note that all the underlying structures that produced that crisis remain. Now another turning point has been reached. As a result of the crisis in the real economy, resulting from the refusal of governments to deal with the pandemic and the massive injection of still more money into the financial system, inflation is ripping through every country. The demand for effective action to combat it is not due to inflation as such, but because the ruling classes know from long experience that inflation drives the class struggle as workers seek to regain the losses in their living standards. But action to halt inflation through the lifting of interest rates threatens to bring down the financial house of cards. So what is our prognosis? It is grounded on the nature of finance capital itself, its inherently predatory character. Creating no real wealth itself, it seeks a resolution of its crisis through war and plunder on the one hand, and an assault against the working class to put value back into its financial holdings on the other. In 2016, the International Committee of the Fourth International laid out the essential issue. Imperialism seeks to save the capitalist order through war. The working class seeks to resolve the global crisis through social revolution. That is the perspective which must be acted on. The events of the past few days make clear there is no time to lose. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I think in the discussion portion of this meeting, there'll be a lot of questions for you about the economic dynamics of both the anti-Russia war drive as well as the sanctions that are being imposed. But before we move forward with the discussion, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Johannes Stern, to talk about the role of the European powers in the present Ukraine-Russian war. He is the editor of the German language edition of the World Socialist website and a leading member of the German section of the ICFI. So Johannes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Comrade Andrea. I'm happy to be able to address and speak at this very important meeting. In the ICFI statement published yesterday, we insist that Russia's invasion must be opposed by socialists and class-conscious workers. We write, quote, "The invasion of Ukraine, whatever the justifications given by the Putin regime, will serve only to divide the Russian and Ukrainian working class and moreover, serve the interests of US and European imperialism." Events have vindicated this assessment. European governments, led by Germany, are seizing upon the Russian invasion to further intensify the NATO offensive and implement long-standing plans for rearmament and militarization. The EU adopted what French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian called, quote, "very massive, very strong sanctions against Russia" on Thursday night. On Friday, it imposed sanctions directly on Russian President Vladimir Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And currently, the EU is discussing cutting Russia out of the SWIFT international interbank payment system. This would have devastating effects, especially for the working class. The EU gets more than a third of its natural gas from Russia, and cutting off energy supplies would accelerate inflation that is already destroying workers' living standards. And even more reckless and dangerous are military measures that threaten to trigger a third world war between nuclear powers. Yesterday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg announced the mobilization of a 40,000 strong rapid reaction force, accelerating the deployment of troops, warplanes, tanks, and warships to the borders of Ukraine and Russia. Germany, of all countries, which invaded the Soviet Union 80 years ago, plunging Eastern Europe into a barbaric war of extermination, murdering 6 million Jews and 27 million Soviet citizens, is playing an increasingly aggressive role. Since 2017, the Bundeswehr has led a 1,000-strong NATO battle group in Lithuania. In recent days, has added another 350 soldiers and 100 vehicles and weapon systems. And yesterday, the Defense Ministry announced that further deployments were planned. There's talk now of sending warships to the Baltic Sea, fighter jets to Romania, Patriot anti-aircraft missiles to the Baltics, and possibly an entire battalion of combat troops to Romania. And just this evening, before the meeting began, the government announced to send 1,000 anti-tank weapons and 500 Stinger surface-to-air missiles to Ukraine as quickly as possible. The entire ruling class is in war mode. Leading German politicians like President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and Green Party Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock threaten Moscow every day, demand a new toughness in foreign policy, and vow to massively rearm the Bundeswehr, the German army. Active and retired military officers appear on talk shows, insisting hysterically that the Bundeswehr was cut to the bone after the Cold War and now must finally be rearmed. For the media too, the militarization of the entire society and mobilization for a major war cannot go fast enough. For example, the daily newspaper Die Welt published an article titled, quote, "Putin has no fear of the West because we have become so weak." And it states, that's a quote, "The Germans in their moral self-righteousness, regression after their hideous years of barbarism, have suppressed everything that is necessary in terms of defense in order to position themselves. Protected by the US and NATO, the country remained semi-mature and immature. With prosperity came a form of vain decadence. Now it's clear that you have to fight back." And it continues, "We have to think more of defense in upbringing, in education, in the economy, in culture, in the media. If we don't start talking realpolitik seriously instead of morality, it's going to be tight. Putin and also the Chinese understand only a policy of strength." To paraphrase Trotsky, not every one of the new German warmongers could become a Hitler, but there's a bit of Hitler in each of them. The war is driven by the nominally left-wing parties in the Bundestag. The SPD and Greens run the defense and foreign ministries, and the left party is also completely in line. Quote, "Everything I said that was critical of NATO has become base paper," declared left party founder and foreign policy spokesman Gregor Gysi yesterday. This remark declares the left party's solidarity not only with NATO aggression against Russia, but also retrospectively with wars of aggression and regime change operations in Serbia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, which violated international law and cost millions of lives. The official propaganda narrative that NATO is merely reacting to Putin and defending democracy and human rights is a pack of lies. In fact, the NATO powers have been systematically encircling Russia since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, with the aim of reducing the resource-rich country to semi-colonial status, exploited and dominated by the imperialist powers. The return of German militarism was announced at the 2014 Munich Security Conference. Steinmeier, as foreign minister at the time, declared that Germany was, quote, "too big and economically too strong for us to comment on world politics only from the sidelines," end of quote. Only a few days later, this maxim was put into practice for the first time in Ukraine. Together with Washington, Berlin orchestrated a coup in close cooperation with fascist forces such as Right Sector and the Svoboda Party to install an extreme right-wing pro-Western regime in Kiev. Since then, NATO has been tightening the noose around Russia. And this policy, which increasingly runs along the lines of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, went hand in hand a systematic rehabilitation of fascism in Germany itself. The far-right AfD was built up and integrated into the political system, and Nazi crimes relativized. At the same time, the SGP was placed under the surveillance by the Verfassungsschutz, the German Secret Service, officially because its program is directed against alleged nationalism, imperialism, and militarism. Back in 2014, we analyzed the objective factors underlying the return of German militarism and warned of the dangerous consequences. In a resolution adopted at a special conference against war in Berlin on September 14, 2014, we wrote, quote, "History is returning with a vengeance. The propaganda of the post-war era, the Germany had learned from the terrible crimes of the Nazis, had embraced a peaceful foreign policy, and had developed into a stable democracy, is exposed as lies. German imperialism is once again showing its real colors as it emerged historically, with all of its aggressiveness at home and abroad." End of quote. The pandemic is a trigger event, as other comrades have stressed, that has enormously intensified the domestic political crisis. Because of the ruling class's policy of herd immunity, more than 5 million people are infected with the virus every week in Europe alone, and about 20,000 die. The war also serves to deflect explosive social tensions to the outside world and to suppress growing opposition among workers and youth. The ruling class knows that with the question of war, also the specter of revolution is back on the agenda. This is one reason why Putin, in his speech on Monday, savagely attacked the October Revolution, Lenin, and the Bolsheviks. The imperialist warmongers in the US and Europe and the Russian oligarchy that emerged from the Stalinist breakup of the Soviet Union are united in their hatred of socialism. Preventing a third world war, as we write in the IC statement, requires, quote, "a revival in Russia and throughout the world of the socialist internationalism that inspired the October Revolution of 1917 and led to the creation of the Soviet Union as a worker state. This means building an international anti-war movement based on the working class in Russia, Ukraine, Europe, the US, and worldwide, fighting for the overthrow of capitalism and world socialist revolution." Thank you, comrades. I'm also looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Johannes. Clearly, the question of German imperialism in particular is extremely significant in the context of renewed hostility towards Russia, and hopefully we can return to that theme as well in the discussion. First, though, we will hear from Evan Blake. Evan is a leading member of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States and of the Global Workers' Inquest into the COVID-19 pandemic. He has authored well over 100 articles on the pandemic, and he will be speaking to us about the role it plays in the present war crisis.
Thank you, Tom, and revolutionary greetings to everyone participating in this webinar throughout the world. The war in Ukraine and the escalating danger of a third world war cannot be understood outside the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The ICFI and the WSWS have characterized the pandemic as a trigger event in world history, which has accelerated the already far advanced economic, social, and political crisis of the world capitalist system. According to Worldometers, 433.5 million people have already tested positive for COVID-19, and nearly 6 million have died from the disease worldwide in just over 2 years. Both of these figures are known to be vast undercounts due to a lack of testing and accurate health data. It is likely that at this point, at least 1/3 to a half of the world's population has been infected with SARS-CoV-2, and The Economist estimates that roughly 19.7 million people have likely died worldwide, either directly from COVID-19 or due to preventable causes during the pandemic. This is roughly equivalent to the 4-year cumulative death toll from World War I. As Comrade North noted, those pursuing war are doing so in part to divert attention away from the staggering death toll and catastrophic impact of the pandemic. Almost every day over the past month, more than 2,000 people have died from COVID-19 in the US, but it's disappeared from the corporate media, which has shifted almost all of its vast resources to the war. Each country involved in the conflict in Ukraine, including Russia, Ukraine, the US, and all the NATO powers, is ruled by a capitalist oligarchy that is hostile to the lives and health of their populations, as well as workers of other countries. They have all overseen 2 years of ever-growing infections, hospitalizations, long-term debilitation, and deaths, which have profoundly destabilized social relations within each country and geopolitical relations between nations. The Russian population has been among the hardest hit in the world. The Economist estimates that there have been 1.2 million excess deaths in the country, or nearly 1% of its population. In 2020 alone, life expectancy in Russia declined by 2.3 years. In Ukraine, there have been an estimated 220,000 excess deaths. In Germany, 123,000 have succumbed to the virus. In the United States, the center of world imperialism, The Economist estimates that there have been 1.1 million excess deaths. Life expectancy for Americans declined by almost 2 years in 2020 alone. The escalation of the drive to war in Ukraine last month coincided with the peak of the surge of the highly infectious Omicron variant, which has ripped through global society from late November until the present. I want to show a brief time lapse of global daily new cases since the start of the pandemic, which highlights the unique character of the Omicron surge. This is from the website Our World in Data. This is the initial global surge of the wild type of the virus at the start of the pandemic in 2020. This continues over the coming months as the majority of world governments refused to implement the elimination strategy first carried out successfully in China, New Zealand, and other Asia-Pacific countries. Here we see the beginning of the surge of infections during the first winter in the Northern Hemisphere 1 year ago, which caused millions of deaths in those countries worst impacted. This took place as life-saving vaccines were just being produced. This surge from late March to June 2021 is due to the emergence of the Delta variant in India, which killed an estimated 2 million people in just 3 months. Shortly thereafter, this is the summer surge of the Delta variant in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly the US, 2 months after the CDC lifted masking recommendations. And finally, this is the ongoing global wave of the Omicron variant starting in late November, which, as you can see, dwarfs all prior surges. Official daily new cases peaked at 3.44 million on January 24th, but remain incredibly high today at roughly 1.7 million infections per day. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation estimates actual infections each day, and they believe that at the peak of the Omicron surge, roughly 50 million people were likely infected on a single day worldwide. Within days of the detection of Omicron last November, it was immediately declared mild as part of a propaganda effort to disarm the public in the face of the new variant with unprecedented immune escape capabilities. As infections spiraled out of control, almost every capitalist government refused to slow the spread of the virus. In the US and throughout much of Europe, ostensibly left-wing governments, which had maintained a pretense of advocating for limited mitigation measures, such as masking, embraced the pseudoscientific concept of herd immunity to allow and even promote the mass infection of their populations. In the US, this process was capped yesterday by the CDC's totally unscientific recommendations that people take off their masks and only put them on again when their county's hospitals approach capacity. Could you show the next slide, please? Not sure if it's showing, but there should be two maps showing the results of the CDC's latest manipulation of science to suit the needs of the corporate and financial elite. Here it is. Essentially overnight on Friday, 70% of the American population magically went from living in a high-risk area on the left to a low-risk area due to the CDC's manipulation of its guidance. Throughout much of the world, this scrapping of mitigation measures during the Omicron surge has been accompanied by false claims that COVID-19 has become endemic in society and is essentially nothing to worry about. The term endemic has multiple meanings, but in general, it refers to a disease that is predictable and controllable within a limited geographic region. As we saw in the time lapse, COVID-19 remains totally out of control throughout the world and is highly unpredictable, the exact opposite of an endemic disease. Despite the fact that a substantial section of the population is vaccinated in the US and many other countries, hospitalizations and deaths have skyrocketed due to Omicron. In the US, there were a record number of hospitalizations in late January, and Omicron has caused the second highest number of deaths of any surge in the US. The IHME estimates that there have been at least 2 billion people infected worldwide since mid-December. Studies on long COVID indicate that likely somewhere between 10 to 30% of COVID infections lead to long-term symptoms, meaning that the Omicron surge alone could cause somewhere from 200 to 600 million long COVID cases globally. This represents millions or tens of millions of people worldwide suffering potentially permanent damage to their lungs, hearts, brains, kidneys, immune systems, and more. Clearly, Omicron was never mild. The ruling class and their representatives in the political establishment, as well as official institutions like the CDC, knew this from the beginning. Next slide, please. The drive to war also coincided with a wave of strikes and protests by students and teachers across the country, opposing the unsafe reopening of schools at the peak of the Omicron surge. Here we see photos of student protests in Chicago, New York City, and Oakland last month, which were 3 of over a dozen such protests across the US, and there were others across Europe as well. The homicidal school reopening campaign, spearheaded by the Biden administration and the teachers' unions, fueled record hospitalizations and deaths among children in the US and furthered the spread of the virus throughout society. According to the CDC, 1,346 children have died from COVID-19 in the US, with a huge spike taking place due to Omicron. As Comrade North stated, the drive to war has been whipped up to try to fabricate a sense of national unity under conditions of unprecedented domestic crisis in all the advanced capitalist countries, above all the United States. The international working class must reject the drive to war, which pits workers of the world against one another in a fratricidal conflict. The war that must be waged is the war on COVID-19. Instead of following the CDC's advice that we take off our masks, workers must take off the blindfold of propaganda issued by the corporate media, demanding that we live with the virus and accept unending war and austerity. The same contradictions of capitalism underlie both the drive to war and the criminal response to the pandemic, which has subordinated workers' lives to the profit interests of the ruling class. The building of an international anti-war movement must be connected to the fight to eliminate COVID-19 in every country. Science and the experience of numerous countries, above all China, have shown that zero COVID is the only viable strategy to stop the pandemic and save millions of lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. We'd now like to use the rest of the meeting to explore in more detail the themes raised by our speakers in their introductory speeches and to take questions from the audience. We have a global audience. There are listeners now from the United States, from Russia, from Germany, England, Australia, Sri Lanka, Mexico, Jamaica, Canada, Croatia, France, Spain, South Africa, Romania, Brazil, and Peru at the last look. Now you can submit questions by clicking on the Ask a Question button on the WSWS stream or in the comments section underneath or in the YouTube chat, depending on which platform you're watching on. We will get through as many as we can throughout the discussion. First, though, perhaps a question perhaps for David, and of course other speakers can jump in as well. On Tuesday, the World Socialist website International Editorial Board published a perspective on the political and historical background to the US war drive against Russia. And it made the important point, which you've spoken to in your opening remarks. Under conditions of crisis, it is necessary not to be swept up by the militarist propaganda that is promoted relentlessly in the media. For this, current developments must be placed in their broader historical context. The present conflict did not arise overnight. Now, addressing this broader historical context, can you speak to the imperialist geopolitics which has taken us to this point? For example, the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, the Minsk Agreement, and the relentless eastward expansion of NATO.
Okay, I will leave the issue of the Nord Stream pipeline and Minsk to Comrade Johannes. He can speak about that, but I do want to talk about the expansion of NATO. I think it's very important that we do that insofar as, again, the Russian intervention in Ukraine is presented as something which has simply happened out of the blue, entirely unprovoked, and so on. Now, to explain is not to justify, but it is to establish the appropriate context. In fact, the problems which I think this always must be stressed, the problems which confront Russia today are the outgrowth of the catastrophic dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, which was itself the product of the criminal policies of the Stalinist regime. I would like to speak to a personal experience which I had. I visited what was then the Soviet Union several times between 1991 and 1989 and 1991. And particularly in 1991, on the very eve of the dissolution of the USSR, I had many discussions with workers, with youth, and also with academics about the implications of a breakdown of the USSR. And I want to point out that among the cities I visited and even lectured at was Kiev and Ukraine. And I want to also stress that among the most class-conscious sections of workers that I met were Ukrainian workers. I knew workers at a factory which was known then as the Bolshevik factory that produced trucks. And I spoke to many youth. And in fact, we had a substantial meeting organizing a group of young Trotskyists at what was called the Dynamo factory. And I have very, very fond recollections of the days that I spent in discussion with workers and youth and also intellectuals in Kiev, which is a remarkably beautiful city with wonderful parks and, of course, an immensely rich history. But it was disturbing, particularly when speaking to academics, to find that there existed staggering illusions about both the consequences of the restoration of capitalism from the standpoint of economics, and also the prospects for Russia within a framework dominated by imperialism. In fact, when I would speak about imperialism, and I spoke to a group of academics at a university in Kiev, I must say that references to imperialism produced giggles. It was treated as a word which had absolutely no significance, that it was simply a swear word employed to frighten people, but had no relevance to modern history. It was a term invented by Marxists, invented by Lenin, really of no consequence. I warned them that this was not the case. They would find out very quickly that imperialism is all too real, and that the disintegration of the Soviet Union would open up Russia to staggering levels of military pressure, geopolitical pressure, in fact, the very breakup of whatever remained of the fragments of the former USSR. That proved to be true. Now, coming to the issue of the background of the crisis, I'd like to have a few maps brought up. The first, I think, was my map number 5. So there could be a sense of the general global framework within which we are discussing this crisis. Can we come to that? Is that on?
Just give us 1 second, David, to pull that up.
Now, this is an important map. I just want to point out that a critical element of American geopolitical thinking is that world domination, and that is what the United States is striving for, depends upon what the geopolitical strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski, and we'll return to him somewhat later, called the world island. He was basing himself on the theories of Mackinder, and the world island is essentially most of the European continent, everything, the vast landmass stretching from the eastern portions of Germany all the way to Vladivostok. And the theory was whoever controls the world island controls the world. And that is the aim of the United States, to establish dominance. And the dissolution of the USSR opened all that vast area, into, you might say, geopolitical play. There are repeated references, if you follow these types of journals, to the fact that Russia is so vast. Why should one country control 8 time zones, and so on? And many of the wars that have taken place have been on the periphery of what was the former USSR. Now let's go to the next slide. And this deals with the expansion of NATO. Now, the Russians have claimed, and there is evidence to prove that this is in fact the case, that when the Gorbachev regime was heading recklessly toward breaking up the USSR, they were assured by NATO that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, would not expand eastward. Some of you who are perhaps somewhat older might recall references to what was called the peace dividend. The Cold War was over. There was no longer any need for a really aggressive alliance. The problem of the threat of so-called Soviet intervention had been passed. But nothing like that, in fact, was realized. Putin recently is quoted as having said, "We were had." That wasn't, of course, an accident. They were had because the Stalinists were basing themselves on a completely false theory of peaceful coexistence, socialism in one country, that really they had nothing to fear from imperialist intervention. This map, which you see before you, which is color-coded, shows you the gradual growth of NATO from its initial membership in 1949. Those are the countries in black. Then the additions to NATO gradually in 1952, 1955, when Germany was brought into NATO, 1982, and then the really colossal expansion, which begins following the dissolution, or alongside of and following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990-91. By 1999, as you can see, NATO has less and less to do with North Atlantic and is becoming ever more Central European, Baltic, Adriatic, and Black Sea. In 1999, a whole swathe of former Stalinist-controlled regimes, such as Czechoslovakia, are joining NATO. There's a further expansion in 2004, and then finally, the last great expansion in 2009. Let's go to the next map. There you can see it very clearly. The map on the left shows you NATO in 1990. The country is in blue. And the map on the right, 2015, shows you the vast expansion of NATO eastward. I think that in distance eastward, it's around 1,000 miles eastward. And the only major, now you have Latvia in the Baltic, you have Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania bordering Russia on the Baltic. Estonia, the city of Tallinn, is a 5-hour bus ride to St. Petersburg. You can also take a ferry across to St. Petersburg. It's obviously, we're talking about a very, very close proximity to Russia itself. The entire defensive buffer, which the Soviet Union once had, has now entirely disappeared. What is not in NATO is Belarus and Ukraine. Now let's take a look at, again, another map. So it has a sense of, again, the region. Everything now in an orange amber color is part of NATO. And one can readily see the implications of Ukraine being brought into NATO. It would be only a matter of time under those conditions that Belarus as well would be brought in one way or the other. Now, again, this is a very critical question, and also very critical to understanding the policies pursued by the United States and their strategy in this particular crisis. 2 points, I think, made by Biden repeatedly are of great significance. One, he has said again and again that the commitment of the United States to the defense of any country aligned with NATO is ironclad. If any member state, any country that belongs to NATO is attacked, that is viewed as an attack on the United States. That really needs to be clearly understood. He said it again, an attack on one is an attack on all. What this actually means is that, for example, if, number one, if Estonia were to become involved in a military engagement with Russia, the United States would treat that as an attack on the United States. That goes for all the member states of NATO. Now, he has also said, and he repeated that a number of times, that an attack on Ukraine would not trigger the famous or infamous Article 5. That, of course, has not stopped the United States and NATO from pouring military weaponry into Ukraine. And their entire strategy in the course of this crisis has clearly been to utilize Ukraine as bait, to draw Russia into a conflict in which effectively Ukraine would be a preliminary battleground, not officially part of NATO, but a battleground or a battering ram against Russia. This is how, of course, it's being looked at by the Putin government. They see Ukraine as a direct threat. I mean, the incorporation of Ukraine into NATO also means that if that were to happen, any conflict involving Ukraine would be a conflict of Russia with NATO, the United States, with potentially catastrophic consequences. And the United States and NATO has been preparing assiduously for such a confrontation. Now let's go to the next map, which I think is extremely important. It's always helpful when one faces a crisis of this sort to go to the maps. What are we talking about? Now, you see where Ukraine is located. To the east of Ukraine is Russia. And then in the middle of the map, we see the Black Sea, which is being viewed and has been viewed more and more as among the most geostrategically critical points in the world. It is a literal state, by which I mean there are a large number of countries which border the Black Sea. Many of them are in NATO. Also, except you see Georgia and Azerbaijan, which have also been involved in disputes involving the Soviet Russia, particularly Georgia. Georgia borders on the Caspian Sea. And that, of course, is the area which is associated with massive oil and energy reserves. Control of the Black Sea is of vast geostrategic significance. And if you look on the peninsula jutting out from Ukraine, that is the Crimea, which has been the source of so much controversy. After the 2014 coup organized by the United States and Germany, but it was, I think, above all, the United States that took the leading role, and which was heavily financed by the United States. Putin grabbed Crimea, which has a predominantly Russian population, and he did so because that is where the Black Sea Fleet of Russia is located. And once Ukraine had been transformed effectively through the coup of 2014 into a colony of the United States, the Russian ruling elite drew the calculation that their most basic national interest would be threatened unless they recaptured Crimea. This, as one can imagine, caused no small amount of anger within NATO, the United States. They felt they had been not sufficiently prepared, and it has been a major objective of the United States and NATO to regain control of Crimea. Now, they have been actively preparing for this, and I want to now just show a few videos, because any idea that this event came out of the blue, that there was some sort of hysterical reaction by Putin, I think is belied by the videos which were made by the United States and NATO itself. And this relates to a number of critical military operations which were launched by the United States, by NATO in just the past year. There were a series of very major operations. I think the first one is going to show Operation Sea Breeze. Can you run that video? It shows the type of tensions which have been building up. It's video.
Just give us 1 minute to get that going.
Amid growing tension with Russia on the Black Sea, U.S. Navy ships and more than 30 vessels from 31 other nations sailed into the Ukrainian port of Odessa for the annual Sea Breeze military exercise. Over 2 weeks, more than 5,000 armed forces personnel from NATO nations, its allies, and Black Sea partners like Georgia and Ukraine are conducting joint training drills in the air, on the land, and in the water to ensure security in the region.
The Black Sea is an important body of water to world commerce and does not belong to any one country, but to the global community.
This year's Sea Breeze exercise has angered Moscow, which called for it to be cancelled.
Hand extraction stations, hand extraction stations.
And it comes after an incident between a Russian Coast Guard vessel and British warship off the coast of Crimea, territory that Russia seized from Ukraine in 2014.
If you don't change the course, I'll be fired.
Russia claimed that the British destroyer HMS Defender sailed into its territorial waters on June 23rd. It said warning shots and bombs dropped in the path of the British vessel forced it to change course.
We will continue to carry our operations into international waters.
But Britain rejected Moscow's account of the incident. It said the Russian ship had carried out a previously announced gunnery exercise.
Well, that's just one. Are we back on? Andrea, am I back on?
Yes, yes.
Again, the value of such material is one sees more of the background to the present eruption of war in Ukraine. It isn't that somehow Ukraine is an entirely innocent party. It has been heavily and actively involved, even though not a member of NATO, in military operations, which are clearly preparation for war. Now let's go and look at the next video, which is about Operation Europe Defender, also launched during the past year. And explain. Go ahead.
Amid growing tension with Russia on the Black Sea.
Building on last year's success, Defender Europe 21 will build readiness and interoperability between allies and partners and prepare our forces to rapidly respond to crisis and conduct large-scale combat operations if called upon. It will exercise U.S. Army Europe and Africa's ability to serve as a combined Joint Force Land Component Command and as a security partner in the strategically important Balkans and Black Sea regions, while sustaining our activities in Northern Europe and Africa. Defender Europe 21 will feature the participation of approximately 28,000 multinational forces from 27 nations conducting nearly simultaneous operations across more than 30 training areas in 12 countries. Critical to this endeavor will be the strict COVID prevention and mitigation strategy implemented by U.S. and participating nations. Exercises like Defender Europe 21 demonstrates that the U.S. commitment to NATO is ironclad, and that NATO allies and partners stand stronger.
Well, you only have. Am I getting feedback? Is it all right?
You're fine to go ahead.
You only have to consider for a moment how Putin and his associates view such videos. They're not just looking at videos, they're looking at the real soldiers and the real forces. So they have clearly believed that they are under enormous and escalating threat, which they certainly are. This is not just sort of fun and games. This is preparation for the real thing, and they know it. And I think this is what underlies the extraordinary level of pressure, which led Putin to take what is clearly a very, very reckless step. If, of course, we'll have, at some point, more details and facts will come out. But I think there's very strong reason to believe that the initial aim of Putin was to apply pressure to compel or persuade NATO to, and the United States to, actually the United States, to enter into negotiations and agree not to press ahead with Ukraine membership in NATO. What he discovered was the United States was simply not willing to discuss this question. They understood its value in threatening and ultimately provoking Russia. One other point I just want to stress has never been raised in the media. It is constantly said that the question of NATO membership is entirely voluntary. No one can tell Ukraine that it doesn't have the right. This is beyond NATO's capacity. This, of course, is a lie. And the best example of this is Austria. In 1955, there was a specific agreement, which was then written into the Austrian constitution, that Austria would not be a member of NATO. And that was a condition for the withdrawal of occupation troops from Austria, which had been there since the end of the Second World War. We might also note Finland maintained neutrality, Sweden maintained neutrality. This is part of normal international relations. Such an arrangement would not be considered by the United States, which basically runs NATO, because it views and has viewed Ukraine as a powerful wedge against Russia, and ultimately using the issue of Ukraine to provoke what could be for Russia a catastrophic intervention in the country. There's a longer explanation, so I hope that's sufficient for the purpose of present discussion.
Yes, I think actually that's a very comprehensive and very compelling account of the growing pressures facing Russia. I'm sure that the visual aids, the maps and the videos were helpful. I'd like to direct the next question to Johannes Stern of the German section of the ICFI. Johannes, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the events that occurred in Ukraine in 2014. The government of Viktor Yanukovych at that time was overthrown in what is often described, and in particular is trumpeted now in Western media, as some sort of democratic uprising against a pro-Russian dictator. And I was just wondering if you could give an analysis of the social and political forces involved and what flowed from that event that contributed to the present crisis.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. I will try to address this question. I think the point Comrade David North just made in placing these events in a broader historical and geopolitical context is important. And obviously this putsch in 2014, which was falsely presented as some sort of democratic revolution in the Western media and by various pseudo-left forces, was of course part of the attempt, and that's what was just, I think, explained very clearly, to integrate Ukraine very firmly into the framework of NATO, the EU. I mean, that was the underlying motives of the imperialist powers who all intervened in these events. I think the beginning of the protests and the crisis was when Viktor Yanukovych, the then president, refused to sign an agreement which was already drawn up with the European Union about a closer association. Obviously, he was more oriented towards Moscow, but he had worked on this agreement. I think the main fear underlying his refusal to sign it was also that it would possibly spark social protests. It was part of the very elements in this contract demanding restructuring measures and so on. But I'm sure also tensions in the Ukrainian ruling class about what's the orientation played a role. But whatever the exact reasons for not signing it, the imperialist powers, and especially Berlin and Washington, considered this to be completely unacceptable. And they then seized on protests which erupted. And I think from the very beginning, they were drawing in mainly elements, middle-class layers oriented more to the EU. But then really the forces which overthrew Yanukovych in a coup then in February were far-right fascistic elements, forces. I referred in my remarks briefly to the Svoboda party and its leader Oleg Tyanibok. He was then, for example, meeting with Steinmeier, the then German foreign minister, in the German embassy. The Svoboda party is a far-right fascist party, and previously they were known for meeting the NPD in Germany. The NPD is, of course, I mean, the NPD is a party even standing to the right of the AfD, an openly fascistic party. So that's the type of forces we are talking about. Then there was the right sector, led by Dmitry Yarosh, also then a man suddenly promoted in the Western press. He gave, I remember, a long interview in Der Spiegel, presenting him as some sort of reliable politician. So that's the forces they worked with. And I think obviously the World Socialist website at the time played an enormous role in bringing out these truths, which were completely suppressed in the Western media. And we were from the beginning saying that this is a warning to the working class, and we're also explaining that this is not only, of course, happening in Ukraine, but also increasingly in the imperialist powers itself. The ruling class is more and more relying on openly fascistic forces. That was, of course, also the time when the AfD was built up in Germany. I also referred briefly to this process of rewriting history in Germany, the rehabilitation of fascism coming along with the return of German militarism. So that were the processes. And what we've seen since is that these forces have been were consciously built up, armed. I just want to mention an important article Comrade Peter Schwartz wrote recently on the World Socialist website, going in detail over the Azov Battalion and other fascistic forces who play and now an integral part in these NATO war games, are armed by the imperialist powers to the teeth. And so all this has to be studied and looked at very carefully. But I think the claim that this was some sort of democratic revolution was obviously a lie promoted by the imperialist powers themselves to just cover up for the extremely reactionary forces they have been working with, and clearly the geostrategic goal underlying all of this was to turn these forces into shock troops against Russia, and that's exactly what they have been doing. And we have also, of course, drawn the parallels, the historical parallels. If now there are these comparisons made between Putin and Hitler, which are completely outrageous in the imperialist propaganda, what is actually the case is that the imperialist powers are following in the footsteps of Hitler and the Nazis, and they are actually working with the forces who are hailing, like Svoboda, the right sector, who are hailing the forces, the collaborationist forces in the 1940s, who have been working with the Nazis in attacking the Soviet Union. So I hope that answers the question, but I think the point is really to not be misled by the imperialist propaganda. And I think the point we made, and I think Comrade Nick Beams referred to it in its remark, is of course that we have the task to follow the map of the class struggle, not the war map. And clearly these fascistic forces are deployed and promoted by the imperialist powers in propagating and developing the war map.
Thank you.
More can be added, Andrea, but I hope that I can only point to the World Socialist website. Listeners should also really study our material. We have a very clear and I think strong record on all these events and developments.
Yes, I think certainly the record of the World Socialist website on the coverage of events in Ukraine and the fascist forces that were drawn behind them is unparalleled. I'd like now, it seems like we have a couple of videos on hand that deal with this issue of the social layers involved in the coup and Ukrainian government sense. So I will just turn it over to our projection team here to get those videos up so we can watch them.
Just to explain the picture of you see of that individual, Stepan Bandera. He was the founder of the notorious Ukrainian fascist organization of the 1930s and 1940s, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And he was directly responsible for mass killings of Jews and Poles during the Second World War. One of the events that took place after the 2014 putsch, involving groups which historically are linked to him, was a renaming of the main avenue in Kiev after Stepan Bandera. And now, for various reasons, I understand in the last year or so, it was renamed again. But what you are now looking at are demonstrations organized by his supporters. If you look at it, this video was produced by Radio Free Europe, hardly a left-wing media outlet. So it's important just to have a sense of what this is. Now, I'd like you to go to the next slide. No, are you continuing with this one? That's fine. Just go ahead. Go ahead with this one. Yes, go to the next slide, please. To the beginning of the slide, which is based on a report prepared by Time magazine about the Azov Brigade, an alt-right sector group, other fascistic organizations which play a significant role not only in Ukrainian politics, but in international right-wing politics. Militia groups in the United States, many of whom, as you'll hear, are going over to Ukraine to get training. And it should just be mentioned that and we reported this in the World Socialist website, I also did a tweet on this, when Richard Engel had a segment on NBC News, I think about a week ago, on growing the preparation of Ukrainian resistance, he was embedded with the Azov Brigade. This is and they were being presented as great heroes of national resistance. Anyway, let's just play this video prepared by Time magazine.
Over the last few years, experts in violent extremism have grown especially alarmed about the Azov movement. The group emerged from the revolution that swept across Ukraine in 2014, and it has gotten a lot stronger amid the ongoing war with pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. The fighting in that region has become kind of ideal breeding ground for militias like Azov. At their public events, one thing that surprised me was how many Ukrainians tend to see Azov not as militants or extremists, but as war heroes. In Kiev, the capital, I watched an Independence Day parade where veterans of the Azov battalion marched alongside other volunteer militias, surrounded by cheering crowds, who thanked them for defending Ukraine against Russia. But even at the march, there were signs of the far-right ideology that's so common inside Azov. The symbols on their flags have been especially controversial. Azov says it combines the letters I and N for idea of nation, but extremism experts see it as an emblem of Nazism.
The official symbol of Azov, it's a version of Volksangel. It was one of the symbols of one of SS division during the World War II. It is one of more or less usual symbols for neo-Nazi groups all over the world.
And it's not just about their symbols. When it was founded in 2014, Azov drew many of its commanders and recruits from Ukraine's most notorious far-right groups, including outright neo-Nazis.
Well, this is not being reported in the American media or the European media, but these are the shock troops of so-called democracy and the liberation of Ukraine. And they are playing obviously a very major role, being heavily armed. There are people could go on, the listeners could go on to the web. If you look this up on YouTube, you will find numerous videos which are reporting on their activities, training programs for American fascists who are going over there. Also, a lot of the weapons which they're getting, these very high-powered automatic material. I mean, even anti-tank stuff. This is going to wind up back in the United States with extreme right-wing groupings who are getting their training and they're getting arms and money from these forces. It's a veritable fascist international and a very, very dangerous phenomena, completely outside of the media, not being reported, being covered up. And this is critical to understanding the overall situation.
David, I have a follow-up question. Perhaps you could answer it, perhaps Johannes. Vladimir Putin has said that one of the aims of the invasion is the denazification of Ukraine. And clearly, as this discussion has brought out, there is a ferocious far-right force in Ukraine, in the military and the government. However, I'm wondering if you could speak to this question as to whether or not Putin, regardless of what he claims, really is some sort of anti-fascist force. There are, I'm sure, millions of people in Russia who are opposed to this politics, who are very close to the memory of the slaughter that the Nazis carried out in the Soviet Union during World War II and want to oppose it. But what should their attitude be towards Putin and his claims to be representing some sort of anti-fascist policy?
Well, just perhaps Johannes will want to speak on it. I'll make a few points about this. I mean, it's totally hypocritical and cynical. Putin himself relies on far-right nationalist elements. He deliberately evokes the heritage, which is fairly miserable, of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Tsar, the Black Hundreds. And it is well known that if you go to nationalist demonstrations in Moscow, you will find, and this is not accidental, alongside of placards of Stalin, who's seen as a Russian nationalist, even though he was originally from Ossetia, but he's seen as a defender of Russian nationalism. So you will see placards of Stalin alongside of swastikas. This is not unusual. But even more profoundly, the threat of fascism cannot be fought through the medium of any bourgeois government. Here in the United States, where there are certainly growing fascistic movements, we don't see the fight against fascism being carried out through the medium of the Democratic Party. Far from it. The condition and precondition for fighting fascism is the independent political organization of the working class, and drawing behind that movement of the working class, the most progressive sections of the middle class. But the fight against fascism cannot be carried out through appeals or through an alliance with Putin, let alone in collaboration with his army. This is not has nothing to do with socialist principles, socialist tactics, and we reject it entirely. I think he's only made this statement in order to somehow appeal to a largely hostile public opinion within Russia itself, which does not view this invasion. I mean, there is clearly a substantial amount of popular opposition to the invasion within Russia for many reasons. There is a long history of fraternal solidarity and family connections between Ukrainians and Russians. A large portion of the Ukrainian population is bilingual. They have very close personal friendships, family relations. And so this is not a popular war. I recall once, in fact, having a discussion in Kiev, which there were workers from Donetsk who came to Kiev to meet with me. And one of the workers said, just in a somewhat jocular tone, but speaking against nationalism, said, look, we're all Slavs, we're all socialists, we should be fighting together. At that time in 1991, one did not really encounter any serious national sentiment within the working class. I hardly remember it even coming up in discussions. So there is opposition to this, and the Putin, however, tries to counter that by presenting himself in some way as engaging in a fight against Ukrainian fascists. I think no credibility should be given to that whatsoever. They will be strengthened by his invasion, if anything else.
Well, before we get to the next question, many of the issues we're discussing are addressed in detail in a number of published works. Most directly, with regard to the war crisis, David North's book, A Quarter Century of War, the US Drive for Global Hegemony, addressing the first Gulf War, the Balkan War, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the subsequent interventions by NATO and the United States throughout the Middle East and North Africa, and addressing what has driven US foreign policy since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Johannes has spoken on the rise of fascism in Ukraine, but also in Germany. The chair of the Socialist Equality Party in Germany, Christoph Andreae, has written a book, Why Are They Back? Historical Falsification, Political Conspiracy, and the Return of Fascism in Germany, detailing the conspiracy in the ruling class to empower and elevate far-right forces there. These and other works are really critical, irreplaceable in gaining a socialist understanding of the contemporary situation. You can find them, you can purchase them at Mering Books, mering.com. You can find A Quarter Century of War advertised on the World Socialist website live stream page if you're viewing it there. After this meeting, we encourage our viewers very strongly to go to Mering, to buy the literature that's been referred to, and to browse the wider catalogue. I'd like to bring Joe in here. David referred in his opening remarks to this extraordinary admission by President Biden in his one-year anniversary speech. He posed himself the rhetorical question, can we maintain democratic institutions here and around the world? And the only answer he was able to muster was, it's going to be hard. And he was referencing, clearly somewhat obliquely, the attempted insurrection and coup launched by, fascist coup launched by Trump's supporters on January 6th. So clearly the question of fascism is one that applies very strongly to the United States. Perhaps you could speak to the sharp political crisis that Biden's remark reveals, especially given what we've said about how the domestic crisis is such a major driving force in the war crisis.
Sure. I think that, yes, that quote certainly goes to the factor, a central factor, which is driving this war crisis, which is the domestic crisis within all of the major capitalist powers, but particularly the United States. And Biden made that statement on the occasion of the one-year anniversary of his inauguration on January 20th of this year. I would say I think he was talking about both the the sort of crisis of bourgeois democratic institutions, and certainly there was behind that the question of Trump. But I think that it also expresses a deep fear within the ruling class of the growth of opposition in the working class, and they look at the domestic situation, and they're terrified. I mean, I think it cannot be stressed enough the impact of the pandemic on social and political relations in the United States and really all over the world. I mean, the fact that you have in the United States now 1 million, almost 1 million people, as Evan referred to, who have been killed due to an entirely preventable illness. The case of China demonstrates that it was not inevitable that this scale of death happened. 1 million in the United States, 6 million worldwide. In fact, the real toll, as we know, is far, far higher than that. But in the US, 1 out of 100 individuals over the age of 65 have died from the pandemic. 1 out of about 300 individuals overall have died as a result of the pandemic in 2 years. Collapse in life expectancy. I mean, and under these conditions, as Nick reviewed, an accumulation of wealth which is colossal, unprecedented. They utilized the pandemic to steal as they have never stolen before, through the mechanism of the Federal Reserve, funneling literally trillions of dollars into the markets. There's a report, if I can read from the Financial Times today on one example. The Financial Times reports today that Stephen Schwarzman, the founder of Blackstone Group, received a record $1.1 billion in income in 2021, and was one of 3 insiders at the world's largest private equity group to receive over 160 million as its profits soared. The FT can do the figure scratches the surface of the wealth that Schwarzman generated last year at as Blackstone stock doubled. His shares rose by $15 billion in value. and Schwarzman earned a further $150 million in carried interest. I mean, you're talking about a level of wealth, and it's just one example. You can cite Tesla and Elon Musk, and of course Bezos and others who have accumulated under conditions of mass death a level of wealth which is really unprecedented. And I think this really lies behind both the social political crisis in the United States and therefore also the drive to war. It would not be the first time that a ruling class sees in war an instrument of resolving or attempting to resolve its domestic crisis. I also think that this is the conditions in which one has to understand the rise of fascism in America, which you're alluding to. It is only just a bit over 1 year since the January 6th insurrection, which Trump himself recently admitted was an effort to overturn the results of the elections and essentially to overturn the Constitution. It's far from over. Trump remains or if not the dominant force in the Republican Party. I'd like to call attention actually to a meeting that was held just this weekend of the America First Political Action Conference, which is headed by an individual by the name of Nick Fuentes, who is an open anti-Semite, white nationalist fascist. And the conference invited as major speakers individuals who are in the US Congress and people who have been endorsed by Trump. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene spoke at the conference. Representative Paul Gosar was there, Arizona State Senator Wendy Rogers. And to give a sense of what what was said, Nick Fuentes opened up by referring to what he referred to the secret sauce of the America First movement, young white men. There were open statements of anti-Semitism, talk about the efforts of Jews and minorities to, quote, replace Western white culture, which was a chant of the fascists who led the rampage in Charlottesville in 2017. I mean, this is, there's a fascist movement in the United States. And it has to be understood in relationship to both the homicidal policy in response to the pandemic and the extreme growth of social inequality. It's a response of a section of the ruling class to the social and political crisis within the United States. Now, Biden represents another faction of the ruling class, the Democratic Party. And again, the response of the Democratic Party to the entire tenure of the Trump administration, 4 years, its response to January 6th coup, its response to the political crisis in the aftermath has been to downplay the danger and to channel it behind an incredibly reactionary program that represents the interests of Wall Street and the military. It's worth again stressing that the central axis of the Democrats' opposition to Trump in his 4 years in power was the question of Russia. The first impeachment of Trump was carried out on the basis of the fact that Trump was withholding military aid to Ukraine. That was the foundation. They were going to impeach Trump because he was not sufficiently aggressive against Russia. That has been the whole narrative of the Democratic Party. Now Biden is in power and you have this very rapid escalation of the campaign against Russia. But in both factions of the ruling class, there is an extreme nervousness of the growth of opposition in the working class. I mean, Biden says, he said at the, let me just get this quote. He said on February 18th, as this war sort of crisis was escalating and there was an increasingly hysterical campaign in the media, he gave a speech and he said, "There are many issues that divide our nation and our world, but this is not one of them. The American people are united. Our political parties in this country are united." He's used the anti-Russia campaign to try to forge a unity with the Republican Party, bipartisan campaign against Russia. That's the sort of narrative. On the other hand, to sort of forge a unity within the ruling class against opposition within the United States. And I think that, element of it, I mean, they look at the situation in this country and they are, as I said, they're terrified. There's growing expressions of working class opposition, strikes, particularly over the past 6 months, from Volvo trucks to Dana to Deere to the eruption of protests among educators and students. There's a movement in the working class, not only in the U.S. but internationally. The final point I would just make is that the other side of imperialist war, and there's clearly a real danger. I mean, the fact that they are now talking in the media about an existential crisis. There's discussion about the end of times, a CNN military commentator put it. I mean, they're talking about a situation that can lead to nuclear war. It's certainly a real danger, but in some sense, what's driving it, the domestic crisis and the social crisis, also points to what is the basis for opposing it. That is the development of a movement in the working class and an international movement. The contradictions that are leading to imperialist war, the conflict between globalization and the nation state system, also are producing the objective basis for an international movement to the working class. So I think that that is the social force that really has to be turned to and mobilized to oppose this really a catastrophic situation that the ruling class is driving us into.
I think that Joe has really given an excellent summing up of the class implications and the political implications of the present crisis. I would like to wrap up this meeting by making a very strong appeal for everyone who is listening to, first of all, join the Socialist Equality Party. The Socialist Equality Party and its sections in the International Committee of the Fourth International around the world is the only political force on the planet that is fighting the war drive that is opposed to both American and European imperialism and Russian nationalism. You can join our political party by find out more information at wsws.org/join. You can also donate to the World Socialist website and help us expand and develop our work. We rely entirely on the contributions of workers like yourselves, people from around the world who are committed to helping fight the war drive and fight the horrific growth of social inequality, the COVID crisis that is being pushed upon the backs of the working class around the world. Just finally, I'd like to say that we had many other questions that came in. There's clearly a lot of interest and a real urge and desire on people to understand the nature of this political crisis, and we will be holding further events to address these questions. I would also urge all of us here to turn to the World Socialist website, look at our material on the anti-Russia war drive, on the Ukraine crisis, on the 2014 coup, on the question of whether or not Russia is an imperialist power, which is an issue that came up. And we look forward to your future participation in further events.